So welcome all who are in the webinar on the Carbon Credit Equality Initiative. We're hoping to see the numbers rise, and we'll start in just a few moments. Numbers are still going up, so just a few more moments and we'll get ready for the webinar. Okay, we have already a fairly good number of attendants. So thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. This is one of a series of webinars where the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, an initiative run by Environmental Defense Fund and Oeko-Institut, and originally founded also with the support and the technical support of the World Wildlife Fund. So this is a series of webinars where we are launching our scores for carbon credit quality. Today, 21st of February, we'll be launching the scores on two important categories, improved forest management and commercial afforestation. So next slide, please, so that I can introduce today's speakers. So you'll hear a little bit of myself, hopefully not too much. My name is Pedro Martins Barata, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Carbon Markets and Private Sector Decarbonization at the Environmental Defense Fund. After me, looking to present the scores, will be Felix Falas, who's a Senior Researcher at Energy and Climate. And then we'll also have Isabel Hasse, who's a researcher in Energy and Climate. And finally, Lambert Schneider, the Coordinator for International Climate Policy, all three of which originate from Oeko-Institut, a well-renowned German-based, Berlin-based think tank on climate policy. So without further ado, let me start with the agenda. So next slide, please, Olivia. So I'll give a first run over what is CCQI, what we have achieved to date, and what can be expected in the near future, what our approach is generically, and then it'll be followed by Felix, who will run through the actual approach. Isabel will present us with key findings, and Lambert will present us with next steps. Next slide, please. So we can skip this slide for now and go directly to what is the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative. So for those of us who haven't seen it yet, the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative was an initiative founded already in 2021 that aimed to essentially provide a source of information for what is carbon credit quality. Why were we doing that? Because at the time, voluntary carbon markets were facing a resurgence in volume. But at the same time that we're seeing this resurgence in volume, we're seeing a mixed quality in the carbon credits that were currently or at the time transacted. So that buyers were increasingly facing reputational risks if emission reductions that they are purchasing to complement their corporate strategies on climate change are not seen or not perceived as credible. But buyers have only a limited scope for doing proper due diligence on projects. And a lot of that determinant of carbon credit quality comes with the actual methodologies that are used by carbon crediting programs. So that was the underlying reason or the underlying context for why we wanted EDF, Oeko-Institut, and WWF to found this new initiative on assessing carbon credit quality. The aim, of course, is to both enhance the integrity of carbon credits over the long run and to encourage carbon crediting programs and the ecosystem in general to pursue the highest standards in terms of environmental integrity. And how do we do it? We do it by providing to the market, free of charge, independent, user-friendly scores that assess the quality of carbon credits. These scores are freely available to everyone in the market. And so they would be used equally by countries, for example, who are looking to purchase through their procurement programs carbon credits, equally companies, but also investors and even individuals, researchers, the academic community, etc. As I mentioned, the three organizations that have founded the project are EDF, WWF-US, and Oeko-Institut. Since then, WWF has ceased their active participation in the project for the time being, but we are certainly counting on their continued support over the longer run. We have partnered with a range of experts, such as Carbon Limits, the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, Infras, Stockholm Environment Institute, to provide us with the staffing to conduct a lot of the assessments which are in the backbone of our methodology. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, CCQI started in 2021. At the same time, we're seeing a lot more other initiatives, and some of us are, in fact, involved, for example, in the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. At the same time, we've seen the emergence of commercially driven carbon credit rating agencies, such as the ones highlighted here in the slide. What differentiates us from these other initiatives, and how are we different? The first thing to note with the Integrity Council, and just as an additional point, I am also co-chair of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, co-chair of the expert panel. So, as I was saying, the Integrity Council is establishing what we call a threshold benchmark, where essentially carbon credits in the market will be judged to either pass or fail a single test across many criteria, obviously. But the idea is that you are CCP approved under the Integrity Council, or you are, or you're not. Unlike the ICVCM, we, CCQI, we're looking at differentiated scores across a set of criteria. Now, some of these criteria overlap significantly, obviously, with the Integrity Council, because we're looking at the same set of issues. But that doesn't mean that we are, in any case, not complementary. With respect to carbon credit types, CCQI, like ICVCM, looks at different credit types, i.e. methodologies, and versions thereof. Whereas BeZero, Silvera, Calix, and other credit rating agencies will typically be looking at credits coming from specific individual projects. We do not have that ability, nor are we seeking to have that ability. And finally, with the ICVCM and CCQI, all of the information is publicly available with carbon credit rating agencies. These are commercial agencies, and they will be providing that information for a fee. Next slide, please. We have already covered a significant part of the existing issued carbon market to date. Our aim is to reach the threshold of a little bit over 80% of current issuance by our assessments by the second quarter of 2024. As you can see, we are now at roughly 55% with the current release today. Next slide, please. We will have, beyond the webinar, I'd like to point you to our website, carboncreditquality.org, where you will be able to find the full methodology and interactive scoring tools that you can work with to check which combinations of methodologies, countries, etc., can provide different types of scores and detailed evaluations underlying all of our scores. In addition, we are providing fact sheets on specific project types that basically sum up the conclusions that we have reached with respect to different project types. Next slide, please. With that, I'm handing over to Felix Falas, who will go into a deep dive in terms of our approach to scoring carbon credit quality. Thank you very much. Felix, over to you.
Thank you, Pedro. Yes, before we are presenting our results for the two new project types, I would like to give you a quick introduction to our scoring approach. Some of you might have already seen this in our previous webinars, but as we might have some new viewers with us today, we thought it would be a good idea to quickly revisit the basics of our scoring approach for you to be able to better understand and contextualize our results. So the first thing that you need to keep in mind is that CCQI, we assess quality aspects of different types of carbon credit. And this is an important differentiation because, as Pedro has already mentioned, we do not evaluate individual projects. And we have defined four main features that define a carbon credit type for our assessment. And they include the type of project. So, for example, landfill gas utilization as a project type. The carbon crediting program, for example, the verified carbon standard. The quantification methodology that is used to estimate the emission reductions for the project activity, and the country in which the activity takes place. So these are the main features that we are looking into when conducting all of our assessments. And each type we assess against several criteria, sub-criteria and indicators that are clustered around 7 quality objectives. And these are the ones that you're seeing here on this slide. They include key aspects such as the likelihood of additionality and the robustness of the methodologies used to quantify the emission impact. And for each of the quality objectives, we have outlined in our methodology detailed steps how the assessment is conducted. And if you're interested to learn more about this methodology, you can find that on our website. So there you can see how the steps are taken to come to a conclusion for each of these quality objectives. Today's webinar, we present the results for selected quality objectives, criteria, and sub-criteria, whose score primarily depend on the characteristics of the type of project, because we think that best illustrates what drives our scores for these two new project types, commercial afforestation and improved forest management. We use scores from 1 to 5, with 5 expressing the highest confidence or likelihood that a quality objective is met, and 1 being the lowest likelihood or confidence. So how are our scores built? Under each quality objective, as I mentioned, we have several criteria and further sub-criteria or indicators that we assess. For example, in quality objective 1, which is the robust determination of the greenhouse gas emission impact, we have 3 main criteria, which are additionality, vulnerability, and robust quantification. And then again, for each of these criteria, we have several sub-criteria. So for example, additionality is built through the legal requirements, the robustness of the rules for testing against legal requirements, the financial attractiveness and prior consideration of the benefits from the carbon markets. Then we aggregate our scores, and to do that, we weigh the different criteria and sub-criteria. However, we do not simply use the average or mean value, but we apply a concept that we refer to as inverse weighing. Inverse weighing means that if the score is bad for one criterion, a good score in another criterion cannot make up for this. For example, in this slide, you see a score of 4 for additionality and a score of 3 for robust quantification. But applying this inverse weighing in our methodology together, this lands only in an aggregated score of 3. And this is because a better performance in additionality, in our view, cannot make up if you have only a mixed performance in robust quantification. As I had mentioned before, our assessment look at different features that define a type of carbon credit, including the carbon crediting program or the type of project. And on this slides here, you can see the combinations for which scores are already available in our interactive scoring tool. So far, we have assessed the program rules for 5 carbon crediting programs that represent the big 5 on the carbon markets. And we also assessed the effect of combining certification under these programs with the CCBS and SD-Vista complementary standards, which has an effect on our scores for environmental and social safeguards primarily. Up to today, we had assessed 11 different project types, which includes some of the most popular types on the market, but also some focusing, for example, on specific gases such as methane. And for these project types, we assessed 28 quantification methodologies, focusing on the most relevant for each project type at the time of the assessment. And also with some methodologies can be applied for more than one project type. And yeah, today we released the score for two new project types, commercial afforestation and improved forest management, and that then brings the total number of project types to 13. And yeah, the findings for our assessments for these new project types is what you are here for. So without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Isabel, who will start presenting our key findings on these 2 new project types. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix. So in our analysis, we distinguish 5 different project types related to forestry. The first is the establishment of natural forest. We released our analysis on this project type already in 2022. It involves establishing a forest where no harvesting takes place. By contrast, the project type commercial afforestation that we released today does allow for harvesting. The other project type we present today is improved forest management, or IFM for short. The aim of IFM projects is to introduce new forest management practices that increase carbon stocks or avoid their loss. However, it is often unclear what IFM projects do on the ground. The description of activities in project design documents are often generic, and sometimes project developers use the same activity description for several projects. Also, it is often not clear how the management practices in the project differ from past practices. It is also important to note that there's no systematic monitoring whether the planned measures are actually being implemented or if they change during implementation. Of course, this is an issue of the project type in general, and it was also a challenge for our analysis. So what we did is we analyzed a large sample of IFM projects and identified the 5 most common activities, which you can now see on the right. They are extending the rotation age, increasing productivity, production to conservation, which basically means that harvesting is stopped, reduced impact logging, and avoiding degradation, which refers to reducing the amount of harvest compared to the baseline. Furthermore, we have identified 2 more project types, avoided plant deforestation and avoided unplanned deforestation. However, we will release the analysis on them later this year. So I will now go into the results of our analysis on commercial afforestation and IFM, and I will start with commercial afforestation. So this slide compares the results of the project type commercial afforestation, as I mentioned, with establishment of natural forest. The project types are very similar because they both involve establishing a forest. Both project types also use the same quantification methodology, so they receive the same scores here, as you can see. However, in our analysis, we found some small differences, mainly regarding the counting of harvested wood products. However, there are some differences in scoring for some quality of objective. First, regarding additionality. In the case of commercial afforestation, the project does have revenue streams from harvesting, which means, as you can see when looking at the second score range, it is less likely that commercial afforestation projects are additional. Also, we scored commercial afforestation lower under the quality objective SDG impact. This is mainly due to the environmental impacts of commercial timber production. Some commercial afforestation projects do use fertilizer, which can potentially be harmful. The harvesting of the projects affects the soil and the water consumption can be high. Now I would like to continue on our findings on IFM projects, and I would like to start with additionality. So generally, determining additionality for IFM projects is very challenging. The biggest difficulty lies in the huge variability between projects, but also between the different activities that we identified. Basically, it is a signal-to-noise issue. There are many factors that influence under what condition each IFM activity is profitable. So it can depend on the tree species, the composition of species, geographic circumstances, and market conditions, and many factors more. Therefore, carbon credits are likely just one factor among many others. However, we determined that it is more likely for some activities than for others that carbon credits are decisive for their implementation. This is why on this slide you see a range of score for each activity. These scores include different aspects, include different analysis on financial attractiveness, barriers, prior consideration of carbon credits before making this decision to proceed with the project, and legal requirements. So this slide illustrates the signal-to-noise issue with the example of extended rotation projects. So the idea of extended rotation projects is that owners do not harvest when they normally would. Instead, they let the trees grow for a longer time so that they can store more carbon. In other words, they extend the rotation age. In theory, these projects would be additional. There is an economically optimal time to harvest when the profits are highest. And carbon credits can compensate the forest owners for delaying harvesting beyond that point. So without carbon credits, the forest owners do not have an economic incentive to delay harvesting. However, in practice, there is a lot of uncertainty regarding the economic optimum. It depends on the timber prices, the cost of harvesting, and a range of other factors. So therefore, the harvesting age could also change because of other reasons, not necessarily carbon credits. We determined that the more the age is extended, the higher the likelihood that carbon credits were decisive. You can see this illustrated in this graph. There is a normal variability of harvesting schedules around the optimum. If the extension is only by a short time span, then it is likely still within the normal variability of harvesting schedules. The longer the rotation age is extended, the more likely it is that carbon credits had an influence. And this is why we do differentiate the scoring for this project activity depending on how much the rotation age is extended. We differentiate between short, medium, and long extensions. The only IFM activity that we score higher than a long extension of the rotation age is when the timber production is completely ceased and the forest is managed for conservation. So now I hand over to Lambert, who will explain the challenges of quantifying emission reductions for IFM projects.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. Quantifying emission reductions from IFM projects is actually the most challenging issue which we have identified. And it's challenging in several aspects, and these challenges are really inherent. So the first issue is that from IFM projects, you can get credits for producing less timber. And this actually breaks with the common carbon crediting rule, which has been established by the CDM, which is also in draft guidance under the new Article 6.4 mechanism, which says in the baseline, you should provide the same service level as under the project. For example, if you produce renewable electricity with a solar power plant, the assumption is in the baseline, you would have produced the same amount of electricity with a coal power plant or another power plant, right? In other words, you cannot get credits for shutting down your coal power plant if you do not build a new renewable electricity power plant. But with IFM projects, this is basically where you can get credits from. You can get credits for producing no timber any longer, right? And that raises a fundamental issue because then the timber may need to be produced elsewhere, or instead more plastics and cement is produced, etc. So this creates a big leakage issue. That's the first issue. Another challenge that we identified is that many carbon pools and emission sources are affected, like soil carbon or harvested wood products. And in many cases, there's huge uncertainty in quantifying these emission sources in carbon pools. And then maybe the biggest inherent challenge is establishing baselines, because that's quite uncertain. How a forest is managed in 50 years or even 100 years depends on many factors beyond carbon credits. It depends on timber prices. It depends on new policies. Some could promote the use of biomass. Others could promote the conservation of forests. And it may even depend on climate change. And so it's really uncertain what the baseline is in 50 or 100 years. But this is what the methodologies try to do, to predict how a forest would be managed in 50 or 100 years. And this last issue raises another issue, which is what we sometimes call a signal to noise issue. So in many instances, the projects may somehow increase the carbon stocks to some extent, but the baseline uncertainty may be much larger than how much you increase the carbon in the project. And so the result of that is that it's very hard to say whether your calculated emission reductions are actually attributable to the measures that you implement on the ground, or whether they occur due to other factors such as changes in timber prices, new policies, etc. Or in other words, it's hard to find your IFM trees in the forest, if you will so. So how have methodologies assessed these inherent challenges? We find two main issues in methodologies, in the 7 methodologies that we have assessed, and we believe that these issues are likely to lead to significant overcrediting. So the first is establishing baselines. Here we see different issues. The first issue is that many methodologies provide considerable flexibility or leeway for project developers on how to model baselines. For example, what reference areas they choose, or what historical reference periods they use. And in some way, these issues are a bit similar to some of the criticism to the avoided deforestation methodologies, the older one, where there's also a lot of leeway how to establish your baseline. Then what we found interesting, there are 2 studies, 2 control group studies, which compared registered IFM projects with other forests which are managed without registering as an IFM project. And there was no large difference observed between the control group and between how the forests are managed in the IFM projects. And the third issue that we observed is a risk of adverse selection. And what do we mean by that? Sometimes programs use regional baselines, and maybe that's a good idea. But if you use a regional baseline, what sometimes happens is that those projects which have higher initial carbon stocks than the baseline, they enroll in the program and then they get credits. And projects or forest areas which have lower carbon stocks than the regional baseline may not enroll. And so in aggregate, that can also lead to overestimation of emission reductions. The second issue is the quantification of leakage effects. As I explained, timber production may be reduced, maybe to a varying degree by different projects, but most projects reduce timber production. And then the question is how much of that timber would otherwise be produced elsewhere. And what most methodologies do is they use leakage deduction. But what we observe is that the leakage rates which are used are on overall much lower than in scientific literature. Also in the scientific literature, we see a lot of different values, which means there's a very large uncertainty how big leakage is. But overall, if you look to the numbers, many studies conclude that in well-managed forests, like in the US, leakage could be in the range of 60 to 100%, and leakage deductions are typically much lower, 20%, 40%, depending on the methodology. And that alone can lead to very significant overestimation of literature, of the emission reductions, noting the uncertainty that we have. And then we observe that some forms of leakage are not accounted for. So international leakage is not accounted for usually, but timber production or timber trade doesn't stop at national boundaries. There's a lot of international trade of timber. And what we also observe is that other effects, like if you produce less timber, it could be that less timber is used in buildings and more cement is being produced, or more plastics are being produced and less paper, etc. And all these effects are also not considered at all. So turning to the next slide, this slide shows how we have scored methodologies so far. On the left-hand side, you can see what our scores mean. So we assign a score of 5 if we deem that it's very likely that a methodology is conservative, meaning a 90% probability. And we give a score of 1 if we think that there's a high degree of overestimation. With that, we mean more than 30% overestimation is likely. Of course, this can differ between individual projects. And then we also take uncertainty into account, whether it's well addressed or not, and we have scores in between. And by the way, that's also something the ICVCM does. So overall, our approach here is quite similar to that of the ICVCM. So on the right-hand side, you see the number of scores we have allocated to methodologies. This is a combination of methodologies and project types so far until today. And you see that most of the scores are in the area of 2 or 3. We haven't identified a 5 yet. We are still confident that we will do once we expand our scores, but most are in the area of 2 and 3. And that is also what we observe for our afforestation, commercial afforestation methodologies, which also score around 2 or 3. And then the picture looks quite different for IFM. For IFM, we have assessed all the methodologies that we have assessed with a score of 1, meaning we see a high likelihood that overestimation is larger, at least 30%, unfortunately for all the IFM methodologies that we have assessed. So overall, this shows there's considerable room for improvement in methodologies, not only for IFM and commercial afforestation, but in particular for IFM. And what we see is that most or many methodologies either overestimate emission reduction or they do not account appropriately for uncertainty. So how do the new project types perform overall? This is another complex slide, but we liked it and we found it interesting. So this slide maps our score ranges. It's 6 selected criteria, which you see on the upper hand: additionality, quantification methodologies, non-permanence, SDG impacts, and a few others. And we use a hexagon to illustrate that. And in the inner part of the hexagon, there's the score of 1, and in the outer part is the score of 5. And then you see a dark shaded area that is kind of the lower end of the score, and the light shaded area is the higher end of the score. And what you mainly see here, I will not go into detail, is but really that the project types which we have assessed are really different, right? They have different forms, which means they perform well or bad in different areas. If you look at the new project types, we have issues, as Isabel and as I explained, in particular with additionality and quantification. And of course, we also have non-permanence issues as well, because these project types are subject to non-permanence. And also the sustainable development impacts are more moderate compared to other project types. Again, what is important here to repeat what Felix said, these are scores for project types, not individual projects. It could be that individual projects clearly outperform and perform much better. Maybe some also perform worse. And what's also important to note is we haven't assessed some newer methodologies. There's a lot of ongoing effort to improve carbon credit quality. For example, new cookstove methodologies are available, have become available very recently, and we haven't assessed these yet. So what do these results overall mean? With regard to establishment of natural forest and commercial afforestation, we observe that for most criteria, establishment of natural forest performs better than commercial afforestation. And with commercial afforestation, additionality is an issue, but also the quantification methodologies. Here, we believe these methodologies could be fixed. Indeed, some methodologies use very promising approaches, which then other methodologies don't, etc. So again, here, as we illustrated in our last webinar, carbon crediting programs could very well learn from each other and adopt the best approaches that they use from their peers, and that way carbon credit quality could really increase. We look quite differently at IFM projects. We see really fundamental methodological issues here. In particular, the signal to noise issue, which I explained, that the uncertainty is so large compared to the increase in carbon stocks that it's really difficult to say what you calculate, is that actually attributable to your mitigation measures or not? And then the other fundamental issue, you basically produce less, and that raises leakage issues, at least for those project types where production goes down, and that holds for many project types, maybe not for all to the same degree. And that puts a question mark for us whether actually carbon crediting, due to these inherent challenges, is the best approach to promote IFM. I don't know. I personally wouldn't know how to fix these methodologies, right? Because of these inherent challenges, that what you calculate, it's so difficult to attribute to your measures on the ground. So this is our main conclusion from the new 2 project types. So what is next for CCQI? We plan to assess avoided deforestation. That was already mentioned in the 2nd quarter of this year. And we want to include in that the new methodology, which was recently released by Vera, and look, okay, how does that compare to the existing methodologies? We are also in the process of hopefully soon starting evaluation of jurisdictional REDD+. We want to enhance our tool, our scoring tool, so that it's more interactive. For example, that you can compare different type of carbon credits which you have selected, maybe that you can search for certain features. And here we would also like to have feedback. What are good improvements to our scoring tool? So if you have some, please contact us. You will see a few more blog articles from us, including one coming out soon on IFM. And we will produce more fact sheets. The fact sheets which we have produced, they provide easily understandable information. They are targeted for buyers. They have a list of due diligence issues that buyers can check with the projects, what they need to pay attention if they want to buy a certain project types. And these have been funded by the German foundation Development and Climate Alliance Foundation in Germany. They have funded the fact sheets that we have produced. And with this, I hand over back to Pedro for our question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Lambert. So thank you for the presentation, also the next steps. Now it's time for, we have some time for Q&A. The first thing that I see here is, perhaps to you, Lambert, can you comment on the degree of expert judgment in score setting? So what constitutes, how do we determine that something is a 1 versus a 2 or a 3?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That depends on our quality criterion. So we have some quality criteria which are quite mechanical. So we have our 100-page methodology, how we evaluate carbon crediting programs. And some criteria are really, or indicators are really objective, I would say. So we look up the information of the carbon crediting program, and then it's a yes or no. And then there are some points, and the points add up. The one or the area where expert judgment comes more in is additionality and the quantification methodologies. And the reason is we were looking into that, but it's kind of impossible to do a mechanical assessment of a methodology. But we try to be, in our expert judgment, as transparent as possible. So what we do is we look at the methodology and we identify all overestimation risks, all elements that may contribute to underestimation. So for example, where the methodology makes a conservative assumption, and all elements where it leads to uncertainty. And then we list all these elements in a huge table, and we look at them in aggregate, and we try to assess, okay, do the possibilities for overestimation, do they exceed those for underestimation, and what about the uncertainty? But in the end, that is clearly an expert judgment, which we also take in a larger team of researchers. So that's not an individual who takes that judgment, but there is definitely expert judgment involved. And the same also holds to some degree to additionality. We have some additionality approaches which are also more mechanical, where we look at certain financial parameters, but sometimes, like for barrier analysis and also some other financial considerations, there's expert judgment involved.
Thank you, Lambert. One of the questions that was in the chat, and I'll refer this one to Felix, was one of the typical points to establish additionality is the assessment of common practice, which can be very specific at the project level or for a specific region. So how is this assessed only at the methodology level? So Felix, you may want to discuss this.
Yes, thank you, Pedro, and also thank you for posting the question. I think this is due to the way we are scoring and the level of scoring. So as I mentioned earlier, we are looking at the typical risks that apply to a type of carbon credits, because we do not have the resources to look into specific projects. And for that reason, what we try to do with our assessments is to research what would be typical non-additionality risks that could apply for a project type. However, also what we mentioned is that, and Lambert spoke to that as well in one of his last slides, is that on the individual project level, any project can outperform or perform lower than the scores that we derive because of the specific design choices that the project makes. And so that's, I think it's the limit of what we can do in terms of looking at the typical risks that apply on the project type level, and the next steps. But it is only a first step in identifying risks, and the next step would be to look at the specific projects, whether these risks indeed apply, or if the project has taken design measures that actually mitigate these risks.
So thank you, Felix. Another question that just come up, and I see that it's from Regina, but long time acquaintance of myself. We mentioned that commercial afforestation versus establishment of national forests would be treated differently with regards to harvested wood products. Could you explain that statement further? So maybe Isabel, you want to get this one?
I think I would hand it over to Lambert, because he's really the expert on the quantification of emission reduction.
Lambert, then.
Yeah, I think one difference is for establishment of natural forest, we assume that we define that project type as nearly no harvesting taking place, right? And for commercial afforestation, harvesting may take place, and some methodologies account for carbon that is harvested but stored in harvested wood products, right? And we see some issue with that quantification. And that's an issue which is not relevant for establishment of natural forest, but because harvesting occurs and the harvested wood products are accounted for in the commercial afforestation methodologies, the issues that we see with how that's accounted for are relevant for that project type.
Thank you. Next, I have here a question from Tiago Figueira. Is there any perspective of applying a similar approach to marine carbon capture projects? Now, my understanding, and Lambert, you can correct me here, is that we don't have to date a lot of experience with marine carbon capture projects. So therefore, it would be difficult for us to do a kind of retrospective analysis of the existing practice of carbon crediting programs. But maybe you can elaborate on the issue.
Yeah, we have a number of project types on our wish list, if you want to say so. So in these first 2-3 years, our goal was mainly to cover a large market share. And so we have focused on the project types that have a lot of issuance. But going forward, now that we have reached that 80% threshold of market share, we want to embark in smaller type of projects with less market share, and some of them may be more promising in terms of quality. And that's one reason why we want to look into them. And definitely blue carbon and mangroves in particular are on our wish list, because that's within the blue carbon, the project type which has issued more carbon credits. But we have a number of project types on our wish list, and so we need to balance that. But it's always good for us also to get feedback. So write to us if you think we should analyze a very specific project type, and that would be really interesting for you.
Thank you. We have yet more questions coming in. Next question is, could you explain how this scoring system would guide investors' decisions? Wouldn't it lead to exclude all projects of a certain type that have a low score? And would that be the desired outcome? So perhaps, Lambert, once again, can you speak to this? How do we think that investors can use our scoring system?
Yeah, we think it's kind of like the first step in the due diligence. Basically, our scoring tool points to particular risks. So if you see that the methodology has a 1 in a score, it means there is a large risk of overestimation. It doesn't mean that all the projects applying the methodology necessarily overestimate emission reductions, because we do not assess individual projects. But in our fact sheets, as I said, we also have very specific due diligence questions. And so that can inform. Maybe what is important, we do not only want to inform buyers. Of course, we want to inform buyers. And the good thing is that our platform is freely available. And so it covers a broad range of carbon credits. But of course, we also want to inform the broader market, and we want to inform also how carbon crediting programs can improve their methodologies, right? So our assessment sheets point to very specific shortcomings in the methodologies, in the criteria for non-permanence, etc. And our hope is that the initiative also contributes to transforming the market towards higher integrity by encouraging programs to looking at our assessment and maybe learning from their peers, but also from us at what are the critical issues and how could it be done better.
Thank you, Lavin. Let me just complement that by saying that we already see that our, if you want, methodology and information that we have provided with past assessments has been used by rating agencies. It certainly has been subject to discussion between ourselves and rating agencies. And to a certain extent, it's also been of interest to many who have been involved in the Integrity Council. So that's our purpose as let's say, providers of a public good, these assessments. And on that note, one of the questions I find very interesting here, and I'd like, sorry for picking you on you again, Lambert, but this is actually a very interesting one, is how do you assess the quality and replicability of our quality assessments? So in other words, what's our quality control system for our scores? Do we have one? And have you tried to assess uncertainty of our assessments by engaging a couple of independent expert teams to assess the same type of credits and compare their results? So can you speak to that, Lambert?
Yeah, so we have a team, kind of a core team working on the assessment, and then we have independent carbon market experts which are reviewing our assessment. And we also send draft assessments to carbon crediting programs to seek their feedback, because maybe sometimes we have misinterpreted a methodology, we haven't thought about a certain aspect, we haven't considered all the literature which is out there, and we got that feedback, and then we look at the feedback and we try to incorporate that. Of course, we may not always agree, right, with the comments that we get, but we have this possibility for carbon crediting programs to also comment on our scores, and we consult with experts. Nevertheless, we are not perfect, and we are always open to criticism and also feedback where you believe, if you believe that our scores are not appropriate, and we will look into these issues.
Thank you. Let me just see here from Saima, great work on IFM, very compelling, particularly on baseline, et cetera, et cetera. How do you deal with IFM that has non-native species? Do you account for soil carbon, especially with different extended rotation times? This goes way too deep for my technical expertise. So again, I'm relying on either Felix or Lambert to answer.
Yeah, I think that depends on the methodology. Many methodologies, I'm not sure I remember correctly, but I think many methodologies do not account for soil carbon, but some do. So what we look at in our assessments of the methodology, which you can download, the detailed assessment, each methodology, about 30 pages of assessment, you can download that. What we do is we do a very systematic assessment of how does a certain measure, like extended rotation, how does it affect different carbon pools? How does it affect litter? How does it affect deadwood? How does it affect soil carbon? How does it affect harvested wood products? How does it affect mobile combustion, etc.? And then we very systematically assess, okay, if you exclude that source from consideration, does it lead to overestimation or does it contribute to underestimation? Like, what is the effect of excluding or including it in the accounting boundary? So we try to be very systematic, in particular in this project boundary effect and how different carbon pools and emission sources may be affected.
Thank you. There is yet another question on our methodology, which is about uncertainty in the assessment itself. So I'm guessing this is an overall uncertainty question. So do we deal with it in any way? I think it's fair to say that where we're dealing with expert judgment, there's always going to be some level of inbred uncertainty into the assessment. But the point here that I would just want to emphasize is that we're fully transparent about our methodology to the point of saying where we are exercising expert judgment or not. So I think that's absolutely clear. Robert, do you want to add to anything related to how do we do uncertainty in relation to our overall CCQI scoring system?
Yeah, I mean, uncertainty varies. Maybe what's good to explain is like what we do is we do not make conservative or optimistic assumptions, like we make best guess assumptions, right? So when we judge, okay, there's more than 30% overestimation, that's kind of our average expectation. But clearly there can be large variability and sometimes a small variability, and that depends on that assessment. And where we are aware, we are trying to be, as you said, Pedro, we are trying to be transparent in our assessment sheets. And we say there's different literature. This is our overall assessment, but it may depend.
Thank you. So Eddie Melendez asks, it's evident in your website that this should be a first step in the due diligence process and that a project level review should be performed. And if so, where can it be observed? Now, to be absolutely clear, what we're providing is information to the market, to essentially any kind of user, from researchers to buyers, to carbon project developers, etc. Whether or not the information can be used in a process of due diligence for a buyer, that really depends on the buyer himself or herself and what it wants to achieve. Certainly, as I mentioned in one of the written answers, if you're doing proper due diligence on a project, a carbon crediting project, one of the fundamental aspects of the overall environmental integrity of that particular project will always be the methodology. And essentially, the methodology can, to a large extent, define or determine the range of quality that a carbon credit project may achieve. Not to the full extent, and therefore, obviously, you cannot simply base yourself on a methodology assessment done by CCQI. You should, as a prospective buyer of carbon credits, also look to other sources of information, including, obviously, the project developer himself, other carbon market associations, carbon credit rating agencies, and other types of information. But we still think that let's say our theory of change is that if we can improve methodologies, many of the issues that are currently bedeviling the voluntary carbon market will actually be solved through having a better or a higher floor of quality overall at the methodology level. Anya Kolmos asks, could you elaborate a bit more how you evaluated impermanence risks? Would someone care to elaborate here? And we're almost getting at the end of the hour, so this will probably be our last response.
Yeah, so for non-permanence, we have a whole range of criteria. One is that we assess how the program reduces non-permanence risks, right? For example, by requiring a risk assessment from the project on how large the risks are and whether then the buffer contributions depend on the risk assessment. And then how, if non-permanence, if reversals occur, how this is compensated for. And there we have a range of criteria for how the compensation works. One of the criteria that's a much debated issue is, of course, for how long do you need to monitor and compensate for reversals? That's where we see large differences between programs. For example, the Climate Action Reserve requires this for 100 years from the start of the mitigation, from the mitigation vintage to be monitored, right? And there are some
Mhm.
programs which only require 20 years from the start of the mitigation activity. So there are huge differences, and that's one of the factors influencing the score, but it's not the only one. There are also other criteria like how large the buffer pool is, how moral hazard issues are addressed, etc.
Thank you, Lambert. So first of all, let me acknowledge that there are several questions that will unfortunately have to go unanswered in the time that we have. We could probably have a couple more minutes to cover them. Unfortunately, that will not be the case. We will come back to those who pose the questions to try and answer them offline if possible. For now, I would just like to thank, obviously, first of all, the speakers, Lambert, Felix, Isabel, and the rest of the CCQI team who's been working in the background. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for the next installment, put it this way, of CCQI Scores, which will, as mentioned already, deal with avoided deforestation project types. Thank you very much. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye.